We're going to go ahead and get started here in a minute. So, good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Water Rights Enforcement Policy Scoping Meeting. My name is Skylar Anderson. I'm a senior environmental scientist and I am the manager of the North Coast Enforcement Unit in the Division of Water Rights. So we're going to cover a few housekeeping items real quick. We're going to ask everyone in the audience to hold your questions to the end of the presentation. And for those of you who may have not had a chance to sign in, there's a sign-in sheet, I think over at the entrance to the room. We also have some pamphlets at the back of the room that have some general information on the State Water Board, the various divisions, their roles, responsibilities, and also the regional boards. And we also have a computer at the back of the room. If you guys haven't yet signed up for our LIRIS list to receive future updates, you can do so at the back of the room. So let's get started. Okay, so just fire safety procedures here. We're on the second floor in the Cali, PA building. We're in the Klamath training room. It's highlighted by the flashing green box. In the event of emergency, I ask you guys all to calmly and orderly leave the room, make your way down the stairs, through the lobby, and out the main entrance of the Cali, PA building, and please relocate to Cesar Chavez Park. So today we're going to be using a web service throughout this meeting. It's called Slido. Slido is an audience interaction for meetings, or audience interaction tool for meetings and events. You can access Slido using your mobile device, and we encourage everyone in the audience to please do so. You can access Slido by going to the URL on this slide or simply searching Slido in your preferred internet browser. Once you get to the webpage, you should see something similar to the screenshot on the right side of this slide. It's going to prompt you for an event code. Please enter the event code WR policy, one word, and it's not case sensitive. So in Slido, once you're logged into our event, you should, if you're on a tablet, you're going to see something similar to the screenshot up here, and if you're on a cell phone, it should look something similar to this. We encourage you all to submit your questions using Slido, those that are here in person in the Cali, PA building, and those that are joining us on our webcast. Oh, so the sign-in is WR policy, all one word. Right there, right here. So it's just event code. You don't need to download an app. You don't need to create an account. You simply just go to the web page, enter the event code, and it will take you to our event. So Slido allows users that are joining the event to view other users' questions. If the question is something that you would like to also have answered, you can like the question. It will then elevate the questions, and as certain questions gain momentum, we'll understand what's important for you all to have answered. And we're also going to use Slido throughout the presentation to engage the audience to answer some polling questions. On your mobile device, you'll notice right here where you're prompted to submit a question, you can also highlight polls, and that will take you to our polling questions, and we encourage you to participate with the polling questions today. So we're going to start with our first polling question. So I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a minute to submit your information. And if anyone... Okay. Yeah, and if anyone needs help getting into Slido, we have some staff around the room. Just raise your hand and they'll come over and help you guys get situated. And if anyone's joining the meeting a little late or joining the webcast a little late, you can join Slido, and that's the service we're using right now, by going to slido.com and entering event code WR policy, one word, and it's not case sensitive. So it looks like we have a pretty good mix of people attending the meeting today with other being the dominant party. All right, we're going to go ahead and start with our presentation. I'd like to begin our presentation today by saying that we are here to get your input on a water rights enforcement policy. The State Water Board adopted a water quality enforcement policy in 1996, and before we begin to draft a water rights enforcement policy, we want to hear your feedback. Our goal is to develop a transparent, consistent, flexible enforcement process that clearly articulates to diverters what their responsibilities are and what the consequences are of noncompliance. Today's presentation, we're going to provide some very basic information about the State Water Board, Division of Water Rights, the regional water boards, and after we cover some of that general information for members of our audience who may be new to State Water Board regulation, we're going to dive into why we're all here, and that is a water rights enforcement policy. We're going to discuss what a policy is, why it's needed, and discuss some of the proposed elements of a water right enforcement policy. And once we wrap up today, we're going to review a timeline for potential adoption of a policy, and we're going to highlight future opportunities for staff and stakeholders to provide their input. So the State Water Board regulates drinking water, protects water rights, and it protects water quality. In the Division of Water Rights, we try our best to balance environmental needs and the use of water. We're located here in Sacramento, but some of you may be more familiar with the regional boards. There are 9 regional boards located throughout the state. Their focus is water quality. They do not have jurisdiction over water rights. If you need to speak with someone about water rights, please make sure that you're speaking to someone within the division here in Sacramento. California's water rights system is inherently complicated. It's a unique blend of 2 very different types of rights, and that is appropriative and riparian. Other rights exist in California, and those rights are pueblo, prescriptive, adjudicated, and reserved. And to make things more complicated, all of these rights have their own specific rules, regulations, terms, conditions, and varying priorities. If you guys could please participate on your mobile device with our second polling question of the day. We're going to go ahead and give you guys a few minutes to have some results start coming in. It appears things are starting to settle out, so we'll give it a few more minutes. But our front runner right now is protection of the water rights priority system. And in second place, we have protection of public trust resources with compliance of terms and conditions coming in third. So we're going to go back to the presentation. And I just wanted to thank you guys all for participating with Slido. This information is very helpful. It's very valuable to us. So the water rights system, as most of you are aware, has been around for a really long time. However, recently there's been a lot of changes as a result of legislative mandates. To highlight a few of the big changes we had in 2010, there was changes to statement filing requirements. Those changes resulted in new frequencies that annual diversion and use reports had to be submitted. In 2011, or from 2011 to 2006, California suffered from the most severe drought on record. As a result, we obtained emergency drought regulations in 2014. 2015, all diverters were required to submit their annual diversion and use reports annually. And in 2016, the measurement regulations went into effect. And most recently, in 2017, the cannabis cultivation policy was adopted by the State Water Board. So the cannabis cultivation policy was recently adopted and recently amended. At this point in time, the potential water rights policy that we're discussing today is envisioned as being broad in scope and generally applicable to all water right violations. So Water Code 1825 states that it's the intent of the legislature that the state take vigorous action to enforce water rights. As we move into the future, water right complaints are continuing to increase, the demand for water is continuing to grow, and our regulations are changing and expanding. In order for the division to ensure compliance with our regulations, protect the water rights system, and protect the environment, we need to develop a process that optimizes our enforcement resources. We feel the best way to do so is the development of a water rights enforcement policy with public involvement and involvement from our stakeholders. An enforcement policy would serve as a flexible guidance document. An enforcement policy could determine present and future decisions as it relates to water rights enforcement and compliance. This would not create new requirements for diverters. So above is a list of proposed policy elements. We believe that these elements would provide a strong foundation for water rights enforcement policy. These elements are included in the water quality policy. We believe that these elements would be a good start, and we want to hear what you guys think. There's a lot of things that could benefit from further guidance. We feel the way we set our penalties, set our priorities, and use our enforcement tools is not as transparent as it could be. And, I just wanted to say again, as a reminder, the intent of developing a policy is not to create a rigid enforcement process. Our goal is to create a flexible tool that serves as guidance both internally and externally. The goal of developing a water rights enforcement policy is maximum prior right protection and protection of the environment. Enforcement also creates an even playing field, ensuring that those who comply with the law are not placed at a competitive or economic disadvantage by those who choose to violate and ignore the law. Establishing a water rights enforcement policy will provide the regulated community with a clear expectation for not following the law. The goal of enforcement is compliance. This goal could be achieved by developing a water rights enforcement policy with an enforcement strategy that focuses on education and outreach. Compliance assistance is needed to ensure that the regulated community and stakeholders clearly understand what their obligations are and what they can do to stay in compliance. If compliance is not achieved through outreach and education, then a more formal response may be needed. The enforcement policy could explain to the regulated community and to stakeholders that the enforcement section will use an escalating series of actions to assist and, in most cases, compel compliance. Enforcement should deter future violations and compel compliance. Enforcement actions should be related to the harm caused by the violation. And, we would really want to hear from those that are joining us on the webcast and joining us here in public, how you guys think we should develop our enforcement strategy. So prioritization is really about what we investigate. It ensures that our enforcement resources are being used to investigate issues that are important to stakeholders, to the public, and the regulated community. A water rights enforcement policy could include a process for the board to identify statewide, regional, and program-specific priorities based off of input from stakeholders, the public, regional board, and staff. Prioritization could broadly identify what we investigate. Our enforcement efforts could be prioritized based off of criteria identified by the bullets above. However, today's presentation is about receiving your feedback. We want to hear from everyone that's in attendance today and joining us on the webcast. how you think we should prioritize our enforcement efforts. So, since 2010, we've conducted a lot of investigations. The icons you see up here represent the more common types of investigations that we conduct. Some of these investigation types are the result of recent legislative mandates, and some of these investigation types have been around for a long time. For example, complaints. Complaints make up a very large percentage of the workload in the enforcement section, and even a larger percentage during the drought. One thing we'd specifically like to hear back from you is, how do you think we should prioritize our complaints? Should it be prioritized based off of a first in time, maybe a high resource value watershed, wild and scenic rivers, adjudicated water bodies? Those are just a few examples, and we encourage you to tell us what you think about those examples as well as provide your own. This graph also illustrates that the Division of Water Rights Enforcement Section is responsible for ensuring compliance with a lot of regulations. So this graph depicts the amount of complaints that are received or have been received by the division for the past 20 years. As you can see, during the drought, our complaints increased drastically, but the overall trend of this graph is showing an increased amount of complaints, and more complaints really translates to a higher volume of workload and, again, a need for prioritization to be identified. So the water rights enforcement policy could contain an analytical framework that provides transparency on the importance of case-specific factors when determining the appropriate penalty. The Water Code says that we need to look at very specific factors, and at the same time it says we need to consider all relevant factors. The challenge we face is, how do we combine these considerations into a proposed penalty amount while recognizing that each violation is unique and different? A method of assigning the appropriate weight to relevant factors in calculating a penalty will provide an objective, unbiased, repeatable process at setting penalties. Penalties should be fair and consistent. Ooh, I got ahead of myself there, sorry about that. Penalties should be fair and consistent, and they should eliminate the economic advantage that's obtained by noncompliance. So we're going to jump into our last polling question of today's presentation. It looks like we have a little bit of a fight between prioritization and framework for calculating penalties. All right, we'll watch it a little bit more. We can go back again after we've looked at some questions and look at the results again to see if they've changed at all. So at this point in time, this is our timeline, or our potential timeline. We hope to have a draft available this fall that incorporates the feedback that we received from everyone that's present today, both in person and on the webcast. And we hope when the draft is available, we'll provide you with something a little bit more specific and get a little bit more specific feedback from you as well. So at this point, we're going to take some questions from Slido.
And we're going to give Skylar a break. Thank you very much. So I'm Kyle Oshandusco. I'm your Chief of Water Rights Enforcement. A lot of the questions that we've received on Slido so far are very centric around, is this presentation going to be available later on? Who's actually speaking? Skylar is a senior in my section, does an outstanding job, and kind of the one that's taking the lead on this effort. Yes, absolutely, these slides will be available later. But I think Skylar tossed out a number of questions along the way and then jumped to the next slide. And I want to make sure that we don't lose any of those great thoughts that you may have. So we could go through the polls and summarize those, but we really wanted to open up the floor to see what are your initial thoughts as we start this process of trying to be a little bit more transparent and trying to be working with the regulated community a little bit more. Are there any initial thoughts that you may have at this point about a potential water rights enforcement policy? We see a brave hand. I appreciate it, sir.
If you have a mic. I have, is it on?
Yeah.
Just a few general questions. How big is the pie?
The pie is, you mean as
Well,
how many?
what percent and what is the amount in the enforcement budget within the division?
So our enforcement budget is primarily focused on people, and so it's the cost of people. It's generally around $5 million, but that number fluctuates from year to year.
And what's the overall division's budget? I'm looking for a piece of pie. I want pie chart.
Approximately about 20 million, but we can follow up with you about exact numbers later on if you leave us your contact info.
Please.
Thanks.
One more, can I? Does the division distinguish between compliance and willful violation?
Yeah, we do. So we have some ideas as far as what is compliance, what constitutes a willful violation, and where we're trying to gain a little bit of clarity is we have our ideas as what it is, but we want to understand from you, what are your priorities? What do you think? And so that's really what the purpose for these types of meetings is. Would you like to share?
Pardon?
Would you like to share your definition, sir?
No. I'm still thinking and suffering here. One last question, General. Do water rights complaints typically come from seniors that are getting hurt? Do they surface from users that are being diminished? Or does someone have to investigate to know if a water right, the volume and delivery and a share, is that something that is readily apparent to all the water right holders, or do they have to really go out and search their neighbors to see if they're getting cheated?
Sure. So we get a wide myriad of water rights complaints through our system. Some of them start with, there's no water in Dry Creek, period. And there's more than one Dry Creek in California. And then it goes all the way down to, very detailed documents and evidence that's provided almost sometimes to the level of a court case. And in those cases, we see injury of potential senior water right holders, but generally our complaints run the gambit. We don't have a specific bucket that's overwhelmingly in one category or another. And really that's why we're trying to work on an enforcement policy, is to try to understand with these different types of, diverters in the system as well as people of potential harm, how do we move forward with our limited resources to make sure that we use our resources effectively to get the most bang for the buck, so to say, in the water rights system. No, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Any other brave souls? So we have a few. Oh, yes, please.
You mentioned that you were going to come out with a publication. I forgot the dates. I apologize. But
All right.
what are you envisioning that to include? Because this has been a very general conversation covering kind of the whole breadth of potential
Absolutely.
topics. So are you just going to come out with potential topics and then further investigate how to implement those? Or I guess I'm looking for more information on what that would look like.
Yeah, kind of what are we doing here and what's our plan kind of thing? Yeah. So I'm going to ask Kyle, our Slido ranger here, to go back to our schedule just so that we can review that. And generally what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop this policy. We have some proposed policy elements that Skylar showed on an earlier slide that we think may be useful. We know that there's a water quality enforcement policy that's out there, which may also be useful to inform this. Yeah. Want to go? Oh, sorry. Oh, it's my fault. Yeah. Sorry about that. So this is our draft horizon here. But really, we're trying to understand, with all these things that could potentially be brought into a policy, what do we feel is be the most important thing to address now? And with that, we'll be taking this input throughout the next couple of months and trying to draft something and come back to the public at a later time with those proposed categories, as well as some draft text and another opportunity to comment and provide input. So this is kind of the first level, and I guess where I really want to hearken in on is that we started on working on this idea of an enforcement policy, and one of the things that kept on ringing true is transparency. And so with that, we figured why not start at the very beginning with the initial outreach with a meeting like today to start building that transparency. So bringing you along the way as we start to develop these types of things. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I know it didn't fully answer it. We don't have the specific date as that we're going to come back with topics. We don't have the specific date as when we're going to come back with proposed categories. But as we learn, as we start to draft that, we want to keep the public informed with that as well. Sure.
Hi. During the drought, one of the things that became evident was that there wasn't sufficient ability to measure actual water use and thereby enforce water rights priorities. What role will the need for increased monitoring and reporting infrastructure and mechanisms play in the policy?
So a lot of our decisions are based on data and what's available, and as the implementation of the measurement regs goes forward, we anticipate having more understanding as to what's happening within each system. And so one thing that the policy could do is help guide us onto how to get those types of better data. It could also help with letting people know what the potential liabilities are of not being able to provide that data or being able to measure the diversions that they have. And so with that, we're trying to formulate some sort of policies to how to support that within the system and gain some more transparency and clarity.
So it seems to me that you answered on the level of individual diverters reporting. What about the synthesis of information and the ability to manage the individual pieces of data that you get coming in? What role will that play in the policy?
Sure. So we're looking for opportunities to do more proactive enforcement. And with that, we need to start off with some sort of data set and some sort of understanding. We have a decent idea as to what's going on within specific watersheds throughout California now, but we see that with the measurement regs, that level of understanding can be enhanced and then help us identify areas of potential concern to which we would then be able to focus our efforts. So at this point, as SB 88 data starts to trickle in, we're starting to pull those schema together and understand that. But we want to get to a place where we can really leverage and move forward to more proactive enforcement efforts, as well as being able to educate the public as to what's going on within their system and understand what's going on with the neighbors, as well as the seasonality of diversions.
And do you have any plans to make more public some of the information that you are getting?
We're always working on that. I know that we're not perfect right now, but it is a kind of a lift, and we appreciate you bringing that up. Although I'm not scribbling tons of notes right now, we have this as a recording, and we have staff throughout the room. The transparency aspect is taken. I appreciate your comment.
Will you be, I'm just going to keep going until someone else.
I have a question too.
Will you be prioritizing in the policy specific watersheds that you've identified as being worthy in some fashion of requiring more enforcement effort, and will you be taking recommendations for that?
Maybe. A very strong maybe. But if you have an idea, you don't have to share it right now. We can meet with you afterwards, but we'd be interested to hear about that. And, really it's not about, we're not really trying to get out and do an enforcement or do a project or target a watershed or something like that. We're really trying to make sure that the system is reinforced and that it's operating as it was designed. Okay. So we're looking for opportunities to educate people, inspire compliance without us having to step in and do anything.
I understand. And one last question. There recently have been a number of hearings noticed regarding different levels of water rights enforcement, many of them having to do with failure to report. How does that new phenomenon, relatively, in my experience, interact with the development of your policy? And is that just that you are publicizing things through LIRIS that you didn't publicize before, or is there a stepped-up effort? And in any case, how does that relate to your policy and what you're seeing going forward?
Sure. We're always looking for more effective strategies, ways to communicate with the public that haven't previously we've been able to reach in the past. I'm kind of hesitant to comment about specific cases or specific efforts, but we are looking for ways to connect with the public and let them know about the work that we're doing as well as the work that others are doing to be able to help out.
For a second, I would introduce myself. I'm Yvonne West. I'm the director of the Office
Hey,
of Enforcement.
sorry, come on.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to address a couple of the issues. I didn't see who was talking because my back was turned to you. There you go. Thank you. Just quickly to elaborate on the few of the issues, because I think they're a great jumping off point for further discussion. So you raised the question about priority watersheds. That's definitely one way we could choose to prioritize enforcement, and that's part of this discussion is, does the regulated community feel like that would be an effective mechanism to look at and to prioritize our workload of enforcement? How heavily should we weigh impacts to natural resources versus priority right system, impacts to the priority right system, things along those lines. The failure to file question that you raised, I just wanted to say, there was a slide here that talked about our increased regulatory authority. A lot of that had to do with filing requirements, measurements requirements. So you are seeing some additional failure to file efforts. Some of it is because we've gotten more media savvy and we're publishing it more through our LIRIS list and other things. But it's been an ongoing annual effort for a number of years now. So it's not really directly tied to the policy, but there is a hope that the water rights enforcement policy will help us to prioritize that workload as well. The failure to file workload.
This is Eric Ekdahl, Deputy Director for Division of Water Rights. To kind of tee off of that, just to give a really specific example of where I think the policy could be really helpful going forward, we have, as Yvonne mentioned, new statutory requirements and mandates under reporting. So now everyone reports every year, regardless if you're a statement filer or a permit holder or a license holder. That's a relatively new development. And if you think back to, as short ago as 2009, a lot of people didn't report. We really had no idea how much water was being used in the entire state of California. When the drought hit in 2014, the governor asked the division, how much water is being used right now in the state of California? And we had to honestly say, we don't know. Our best guess comes from 2010, right? So all of a sudden there's new legislation that requires these new reporting elements. It's really going to be critical going forward. But the outcome of that is now we have 40,000 water right holders in the state of California. They're supposed to report each year. And the process of making sure that they're aware that they need to report, finding them if they don't report, reminding them that they're late, following up again and again can be really time consuming. And so the policy is potentially a tool that we can look at to say, all right, how much time and effort should we spend on this? What is the kind of appropriate monetary penalty for failure to file elements? And just for an example, this year, you noted that there's a bunch more coming out. The process that we went through to even get to the hearing phase, we sent a reminder letter in February of last year. We sent another reminder email prior to the April 1st reporting deadline. We sent another reminder email in June. The July final deadline for reporting passed. We sent another deficiency letter in August. We sent a final warning in September. We sent first ACLs in October, and now we're finally settling out the kind of hearing process. That's 8 different cracks at the apple. And you can think about, well, if I'm late with my car registration at the DMV, how many cracks at the apple does the DMV give you? None, right? You're late, then you start paying additional fees and you start doing excess penalties. So trying to help balance the new failure to file requirements, the intense amount of work that is going into those when maybe our priority should be something else. If so, what is that priority? How do we kind of balance these really disparate kind of workloads inputs and needs for everybody across the state of California. And that's what we're really looking for in this first kind of round of public input. What should we focus our priorities on? How can we think about this as kind of an integrated system, looking at SB 88 data that we're going to start getting in, looking at in-stream flow requirements, looking at protection of senior rights, looking at everything else that the division is doing, looking at cannabis, looking at kind of new things that come down the legislative pike. The hope is we kind of do these early listening sessions in March of this year, and we come back sometime in the fall with a pretty well fleshed out draft that's going to list out, all right, here's where we think we should go, here's what we think the different elements are going to be. And then there's going to be another round of public input, public comment, and public discussion at that point before it moves forward for board consideration and adoption. So that's kind of a long-winded and longer overview, but you can kind of use these different things to kind of figure out why we're looking for the input that we are. I think the complaints example that Skylar gave earlier is a really good example. We get hundreds of complaints. How do we focus them? First come, first serve, priority watersheds, cannabis, public trust. There's a lot of different options, and there could be different workloads and repercussions based on each one of those. We value the input that the kind of regulated community has. You know, they've lived with our enforcement efforts and our regulations for the last 40 years or so. And how has it worked? Where do we need to focus more energy? Where has there been too much input? All of this comment is going to be helpful as we develop the draft of the text going forward.
Yeah, and I don't have much to add to that. I just wanted to kind of address some of the specific issues raised. I'd love to hear those discussions. I'd love to hear more about whether the regulated community thinks we need to adopt a measuring methodology or a water, you know, how specific we need to get in this policy is kind of still open for discussion. And we're, like I said, we're scoping it. But they're all good questions. Back to Kyle to address the rest of these questions.
So I think we had one more comment from the audience, or one more question. Do you still have a question?
Oh, okay. One of the things that we've seen is a lot of times there'll be a complaint for somebody who basically either needs a water right permit when they don't have one at all, or needs to file a petition to amend an existing permit because they're doing some activity that's not authorized by the permit. And often the permittee or water user will say, okay, fine, I'll go ahead and file an application or a petition. And my question is, do you envision any coordination between the enforcement unit and the application and permitting unit so that there can actually be follow-up and a person who wants to come in compliance actually can finally either get a new permit or a change order so they can be in compliance? Because a lot of times that subsequent step ends up being a multi-year delay.
So the shortest possible answer I can think of is yes. Follow-up in the compliance and ongoing monitoring surveillance is key. And the fate of those types of complaints, the fate of those types of issues is of concern. You know, we're not looking for opportunities where it just goes to another bin and say, well, it's over in applications or it's over in blank. So we are looking for those opportunities. We have some of them right now. We want to enhance those moving forward. And we think that having some type of enforcement strategy or policy could aid in that discussion.
That doesn't really answer my question. My question is, and maybe this is for Eric, for you, is my question is, would there then be any way to prioritize the actual processing of applications and petitions to bring the entity into compliance?
In the short answer is there could be. It's a tougher question than just, sure, we're going to prioritize those. A lot of times what we find is we'll do an enforcement sweep, for example, and we'll find 25 illegal ponds in a watershed. And I'm making these numbers up. This isn't real. I'm creating this for the sake of discussion. And we'll come in and we'll say, all right, you have kind of two choices, either come in and apply or take out your diversion structure and render the pond no longer capable of storing water. Well, most people don't want to do that second option. So they come to us with a series of permit applications, but there could be existing policies in place that really make those applications not very viable going forward. And so we get into a chicken and the egg kind of scenario, which one's going to give first? Is it going to be the division in terms of relenting on some conditions? Is it going to be the applicant being willing to engage in some more costly efforts to make their diversion structure more environmentally friendly? there's a little bit of give and take there, and the enforcement policy could be a place to better articulate the process by which we're going to do that going forward. For example, it could say, when we do an enforcement sweep and we identify illegal water diversions or illegal issues, we're going to recommend this pathway going forward and set out some kind of general guidelines for how we're going to address it. That's a possibility.
So I also want to be true to the folks that aren't with us in the room that have been using Slido to engage, which we really do appreciate. We're going to take a few questions up here, and then we can flip it back to the audience. Question number 1 up on the screen is, are there any plans to increase the number of stream gauges in currently ungauged systems to assist with estimations of water usage? So maybe. We're aware that there may be a bill floating through legislature right now that kind of discusses this issue, so we don't want to get too much into it and give that bill its day. But understanding that more information is needed, and one of the tools to obtain information is to obtain more stream gauges or implement those and monitor the system. So that could be something that would be informed by this process as well as the building of the policy or throughout compliance throughout the system. Second one, why aren't the regulations sufficient? So we had a decent slide from Skylar earlier on about all the specific actions that we need to take into account when we're assessing or we're alleging a violation. And some of them are very clear cut. What is the diversion amount? How many days was this violation going on? But some of them might be a little bit less articulate or less pointed. And so we're trying to understand how to work through that vague regulatory language to arrive at some sort of potential monetary penalty. When we look at an analogous discussion on the water quality enforcement policy, there's a whole policy methodology, and actually their policy spends a quarter of all of the pages, so a hot 25% of their text is focused on how to arrive at some sort of proposed monetary liability. And so that's one of the questions that would be useful potentially for this group is, do you think that we should dive into the amount or dive into the the potential penalty calculation as much as the water quality enforcement policy? Is that helpful? Is that something that you may want to see in a water rights enforcement policy? And it looks like we just moved another one to the top here. Sorry, I did pass the DMV-I exam, but not this one here. While there may not be a quote-unquote published policy, management has a strategy that has directed past enforcement. Will the division articulate this policy? So at this point, we're moving forward with the direction that we have within the regulations as well as the expert opinions provided by our legal counsel. So we're working through the system to understand the complaints that come in, triage those ones that appear that they're causing harm. We start to develop more investigations and look into those issues. Ones that we don't seem to have enough information for one reason or another, we try to get back to those complainants and ask them for more information. Is there a way to engage with them? As well as with our homegrown investigations, we have staff that are actively looking throughout the water system to identify potential issues. But this is a great opportunity for us to maybe get better clarity. What do you feel like is important for us to address, and what would be the most efficient way to address it? Alrighty, so I'm going to take this one and then we'll go back to the room here. Once again, great questions are coming in on Slido. If we don't have enough time here today, we'll be sure to archive those and generate responses to comments later on after this meeting. So question, will interim conditions be considered for illegal diverters who are coming into compliance but have not yet received a water right? And so that one, unfortunately the question answer may or may not be in the room, but the question is, or the answer may be, I don't know. Is it appropriate for this to occur? Is it appropriate that somebody who's coming into compliance have this, kind of stay of enforcement actions? What is the harm that's being caused? What do you think, by a show of hands? Do you think that we should maybe try to implement any interim conditions for people that are coming into compliance? Good idea? Yes? No? Sheepish yeses? That's fine. I appreciate it. So let's pop back into the room here. Are there any other questions that we haven't gotten to yet? All right, so seeing all of these hands go up in the air, let's go on to the next one here. Why not leave enforcement to challenges between and among water right holders? If you're injured, sue me. That is a course of legal recourse. I don't know. I think that there may be an opportunity here for leadership at the statewide level to get that firm, fair, consistent application of water rights law. Are there ways that we can help disagreements between neighbors? Is there a way that we can head off these types of arguments ahead of time without having to go down this path where we get to a very declarative, if you're injured, sue me? Maybe there's an opportunity in a policy to develop some guidance to show that there are consequences for noncompliance. And I see a lit microphone here.
Yeah, this is Yvonne West again. I just did want to say that there is also another component. I mean, and that's our obligation to protect the public trust resources that it generally isn't addressed when you have, two private parties suing each other judicially because of impacts to their rights, their priority of rights. And so our mandate is much broader than just the causes of action between individual parties. And so the policy will address both situations, and it won't do anything to impact the ability of individuals to sue each other judicially if that's the route they want to go for a resolution.
I would further act that I think there's an equity issue in that approach, in that taking anybody to court is not necessarily a cheap or time reasonable exercise. And so while that may be an option for very, very wealthy in terms of water, so water right holders that have a lot of water and have a lot of money that come out of that, if I'm a small riparian holder who's being harmed by an upstream, much larger diverter, that's a really, really hard and high hurdle for that small riparian holder to address. And so there's economic issues, there's probably disadvantaged community issues that make that, I think, a really untenable approach for the long term.
All right, so as you can see on Slido here, we went back to one of the polls that asked about what the most important proposed policy element would be to you. And so I thought it would be worth going back to this now and just looking at especially like those top two, and then if you have any further thoughts in the audience on those top two, particularly that top one. I think we'd like to really hear why you answered it the way you did. All right, would you like to return to the Slido questions then, this time? Okay. I think we have a couple more that got upvoted on the Slido questions.
All righty, next one. Will the framework of the draft policy be an iterative process up to fall 2019 release? Will the compiled data at each iteration be made available to the public? As to the best extent that we can, we would like to be sharing that information. There are some cases where somebody may submit a comment to us that they feel like they want to stay anonymous, so we'll try to aggregate those as best as we can. At this point, we're planning on releasing a draft based on the input in fall of 19. If there's a need for another iterative process after that, we'd be looking at working with our board to see what their direction would be at that point. Fall 19, what we're trying to focus in on is the next opportunity to our goal to bring some language back to the public and back to this group. Next one, why is there such a high, thank you. Enforcement so far has been moderately paced, reasonably escalated, well communicated. Will the pace of enforcement increase? And that's from Sean Pike. We appreciate that. The first question from somebody not named anonymous. Small joke, sorry. It depends. So in some cases, we come across a very egregious violation where maybe somebody is stealing water that's very significant and causing lots of harm. In cases like that, we would want to work as quickly as possible to rectify the situation. In other cases, there's an educational outreach component, maybe with a new landholder, and they don't understand their responsibilities as a water right holder as well. And so we'd want to work with them and appropriately escalate through the their responsibilities, and if there was non-compliance, move forward with formal enforcement. That's one thing that we're really trying to articulate. In the past is we've had this way of using progressive enforcement by always starting off with humility and understanding and trying to understand what's going on within the system, and then building up to, if needed, some more adverse actions that potentially could cost people monetary liabilities.
And I do want to go back and address the question about staff turnover. From my perspective, it's because we train them so well, and we have such great staff that they are really desirable by other state agencies and by other units within the organization, and they get promoted really quickly. So it's just, it's tough to keep up. I'm not biased, though.
Alrighty, so let's see if we can catch up here. Another one from our anonymous one, very busy today. Will monetary penalties consider the cost of avoiding CEQA for illegal diverters who are coming into compliance and are then exempted from CEQA? So at this point, we have guidance from the regulations that says consider economic factors. This could be an economic factor. I'm not an economist, but maybe this question more poignantly highlights the fact that maybe the regulations are a little bit too vague in this scenario. Is there an opportunity here with a policy where we could help clarify situations like this? We're starting to think that way, but we would like to hear from you a little bit further, and thanks to Anonymous for posting this one here. So once again, feel free to pop your hand up in the air if you have a follow-on comment or question. All right, so the next one up, posting case resolutions will give us a useful feedback on how the board is enforcing regs in practice. I appreciate that. So we're looking at ways to communicate with the public in ways that we haven't in the past. Social media is a good avenue, ways that we've been able to get out and do some public outreach and some educational opportunities, go to regulators, stakeholder events, or going to maybe an ag commission meeting or something like that. We're always looking for these new ways, and it really comes down to the core of, people receive information in a different way. And so our traditional way of maybe always issuing letters or posting things in the newspaper may be good for some, but maybe doesn't work for all at this point. So good question, we'll keep it up, and one way that we're trying to engage with you throughout this process here. All right, will both the polling survey results and the audience questions be posted along with the presentation slides? Yes, so we'll post that after our outreach effort here. There's a follow-up question, sir. Let me make sure we get you a microphone.
All right, I thought you brought it to me alive. Simple question, the questions are coming off as you guys answer them up here, and they're no longer on the online version. So when you go publish them, are those lost, or are they archived somewhere so you'll be able to publish all the questions?
They're being archived through the app, so we still have those questions. Thank you. Sorry we didn't hit on that earlier. All right, will monetary penalties consider the, we already got that one. Will there be any leniency for diverters who have been waiting for an appropriative right for many years? Some decades-old applications are still in process. So yes, we acknowledge that some of these applications have been sitting there for a bit. We would also like to acknowledge that there are a number of applications that have been submitted, and also acknowledge that there are very few application staff that are serving the state of California. This is an important one that we are cognizant of, and when we're reviewing specific cases, we try to take these types of things into consideration and understanding about where they're at in the regulatory process and where's the action that inspired either a complaint or some sort of how it got onto the enforcement radar.
But I do also want to jump in here, and the question is kind of maybe strangely worded because it implies leniency for diverters who have been waiting for an appropriate right for many years. So if you're waiting for an appropriative right, you shouldn't be diverting in the first place. And so if you start diverting without coming in to get your permit, that is a scenario where we would take enforcement. Now, at the same time, some pending applications that we have were caught by enforcement sweeps where we've then directed them to come in and get an application, and we don't take kind of current enforcement as long as they're in that process. whether or not we continue to do so in the future, I think is a question for the policy and is something that we are seeking feedback on. Has that been a productive way of bringing people into the regulatory fold or not? I think that's an open question. And then, with that last part of the sentence, some decades-old applications are still in process. That is true. But when you look at what's holding up these applications, in some cases, it's oftentimes not the board waiting, it's that the applicant hasn't finished CEQA or it hasn't finished protest resolution. Those are two elements that are outside of the board's control, really, to drive. And so something that we've been working on internally that you'll likely see in the next month or so is a review of all of our pending applications that does an analysis of, whose court is it in? Is it in the applicant's? Is it in ours? Or is it in somebody else's? And the results are illuminating. We're going to post it on our website. I think, again, in the next month or so. It's color-coded. It's a nice kind of guidance tool. So just a little additional information.
Sir?
Yeah, this kind of goes back to the unwritten policy question that was up there before, and it just triggered again with the notation that sometimes when you go on an enforcement sweep, the question, I guess, is what has driven some of those decisions and the focus of where those sweeps have occurred in the past, and will some of that play into the future enforcement policy considerations?
So we have, I'll just jump in, we have a board at the state board, and so the priorities of the Division of Water Rights Enforcement team, in large part, historically has been driven by the priorities of the board at that time. And so we have been directed to look at in-stream ponds, we've been directed to look at kind of drought resources and kind of illegal diversions during drought. I think actually one of the benefits of the policy is that it kind of sets our priority a little bit outside of the kind of random iterations of kind of the current flavor of the month, if I can say it that way. And we have a very direct kind of set out written policy on what we're going to look at and how we're going to look at it. It doesn't mean we can't go off and do other things. It's not, again, intended to be a rigid thing. It wants to be flexible. So we do have a little bit of opportunity to kind of look at different types of projects, but and that's not then to preclude the board from weighing in on it, because it would be a board adopted policy. They'll have ample opportunity to direct us to edit or change that policy over time. But it makes it a little more immune to other external forces at the time. There was a question also, what is our current enforcement priority? We don't have one. It's broadly directed at all those different things that Skylar put up with the different floating little bubbles, and those are all the different things that we work on. And internally we talk about, well, where do we think our priorities are? But that's, again, the whole point of having this policy, is to really solicit external stakeholder feedback as well as our own board's feedback, and to see where they want us and stakeholders want us to go.
Sure. Sir?
Hi, sort of an answer in part to one of your questions and a follow-up question. One of the questions that came up was, should there be continue the policy of not doing immediate enforcement if someone has gone through the application process and is working towards something? And I think for many of us, the answer to that question in part is, well, kind of like what you're saying a lot, it depends. It depends a lot on how long that application process is taking. And I do appreciate that CEQA is often a bottleneck. Protest resolution is something that I don't completely agree with Mr. Ekdahl that isn't completely outside the hands of the board. I think the board could at times be somewhat more aggressive in prodding protestants and applicants or petitioners to move forward with protest resolution. So my question goes to sort of generally, is water rights going to, and how can water rights bring on more people, more staff to get the process working better? Because the answers to many of these policy questions really depend on how functional the overall division is. And if it's been like it has been, I mean, we have complaints that are more than a decade old, or that got set aside and there still is no substantive resolution. That puts us on a certain policy trajectory that may say, well, if we can get something done, then maybe that's more important than putting something in the pile that's going to stack up for 5 or 10 years. But if there's consistent turnover and movement on both complaints, applications, petitions, those kinds of things, then the answer could be substantially different. So my question now is, what are the opportunities to bring on more staff and to sort of improve the pace of the division in general, and how could folks outside help to make that happen?
I'll field this one. Feel free to jump in, Yvonne, also. But, I'll answer maybe those in parts. The first part, how do we bring on more staff into the division? That's kind of a budget change proposal process that we have to work through the legislature to do. And almost universally, it means higher fees for fee payers. And roughly right now, we have a water rights fund that fee payers pay kind of a per acre foot charge every year on. It doesn't apply to everybody. It only applies to really post 14 appropriative right holders. And then there's a smaller fee for some other types of holders that have de minimis kind of levels of use. But in general, every person that we add to the division is about a 1% increase in a water right fund fee payer's fee. So that's, a pretty tough ask in some respects to go to fee holders and say, we need you to pay an additional 20% for 20 new staff. That's just something that hasn't really been viable going forward. The legislature could step in and intervene, and they have the power and the discretion to do so, and they could. There is also the question of, and this is a little plug, there is a fee stakeholder meeting, I think, scheduled for later this month. Is it the 19th, 18th?
18th.
March 18th. We'll be at the Water Board here in the Cal EPA building, where we'll talk about water right fees for next fiscal year, and as well as water quality fees, I believe. So if you're interested, please attend that. I think there will be proposed changes to the water right fees schedule going ahead. So that's kind of part one. The other option, you could have general fund support some staff. The issue historically has been with the general fund that while times are maybe flush right now, it's not too long ago, you go back to 2008, 2009, where in fact what happened was you did have several dozen water rights staff that were general fund supported, that when that general funding was cut, we had to find other positions for them and rearrange them. So, it's really tough to kind of manage a whole set of people when you're at the whims of the financial going-ons of the rest of the state. That's, again, not a complaint. It's just kind of an expression of that's where things are right now. So you have general fund support or you have fee support, and those are really the kind of two options on how you get more staff. In terms of how the division can kind of look at moving things more quickly and what other people can do, we've talked about maybe some specific legislative changes in the past, little tiny tweaks to the water right system that wouldn't result in whole-scale changes, but, we look at petitions. Petitions we have a backlog of petitions, and some of them are because, there's a minor change in the point of diversion that might be 100 feet off from where they noticed it originally in their application back in 1962. Do they have to go through a full change petition for that? Should they have to? It adds to the workload. It adds to the kind of set of things that the staff have to do. It's not to say that there shouldn't be a petition process for that in some circumstances, but when there's no people in between, and there's no real change in public trust resources or the environment between a point 100 feet upstream or 100 feet downstream. Is that whole process necessary? So little things like that could help, but that's not really going to get at the big question that I think you're getting at, which is what can we do to really fundamentally look at moving big, important projects forward more quickly? And that's a tougher question. I've had that conversation 3 times in the last 2 days. What does it mean when you get a complaint? We were talking about this earlier. A complaint can be many things, right? Someone's taking my water. That's a complaint. That's actually the kind of complaint we got during the drought. And we actually have to look at each one of those seriously. But that's a really tough complaint to actually handle. What does it mean, taking my water? Whose water is it? What's your water right? We've actually had circumstances where somebody has come into us and said, somebody's interfering with my water rights. And then you look at the person who issued the complaint and they're wildly out of violation. What do we do then? Do we find that person? It's really complex. And we can look at things like hearing processes to maybe drive some of the protest resolution, but that's not necessarily any quicker than anything else. You still have to deal with CEQA one way or the other. That can be immensely time consuming. I think we've had some of these discussions, but it's not an easy, straightforward answer.
Quick follow-up. If you have a relatively small diverter in a coastal watershed, for example, that has to do CEQA in order to complete the application or petition process, does the board become the lead agency in those, or how does that work? And
If it's a
let's
private,
answer that question.
If it's a private entity, yes, we become lead agency. If it's a public entity, we do not.
So, do you have dedicated staff that specifically does CEQA as opposed to CEQA and the underlying water rights? How do you divide those tasks, and how can we move CEQA along more quickly? Because it seems like that is one of the big bottlenecks.
We don't have staff specifically working on CEQA. A lot of times we actually contract it out, but then staff still review it anyway. And that does save time, but it's still not a silver bullet that's magically going to move things along more quickly. But again, that's kind of an application. That's a slightly different topic than enforcement, but let's follow up with those later on.
All right, so we have a few more flagged in Slido. We can flip back here for a moment. Shouldn't monetary penalties be set by the California legislature? So within our statutes and regulations, it directs us for some specific monetary penalties, on how much volume was diverted, or how many days of diversion, or if it was during a drought, or their multipliers. We also need to consider the legislature also directs us to consider other things too. So we were talking earlier about economic advantage. We're also thinking about, what is the extent of harm, and how does that play into the violation to which we find ourselves. The next one by Publius, is that right? How will the Division of Water Rights make the determination that there is insufficient water to support a claimed right to divert? What tool will it be used? So this one's starting to slip a little bit more out of the enforcement policy discussion. We look at streams as available using the available data that we have, as well as generating our own investigations on what constitutes a fully appropriated stream. And then our applications unit and permitting and licensing would then be moving forward to identify if there's water available, working on the petitions and licenses that are in front of them. If there isn't water at that point, then they would be looking to potentially make that type of finding. I'm going to skip over that one a little bit more, as it delves a little bit outside of what we could potentially have in a water rights enforcement policy. Another good one by Anonymous, specifically, what kind of input are you looking for in regards to a policy? So we have some ideas as to what we feel, how our business processes would be improved by having a policy. We have some ideas as to what would be a little bit more transparent to the regulated community. But that's really kind of where they're at. It's our ideas. Without engaging the regulated community and having information meetings like this, we don't know what's important to you. So specifically, if there's an issue that you feel could be clarified, specifically if there's something that needs clarification, or you feel that regulations are silent or we've been silent on in the past, If there was something to be a prioritization for complaints or investigations that move forward within the enforcement section, do you want to have input on that? And if so, what are your specific proposals? If you see great ideas that are potentially out in the water quality land or some other facet of government that you think might be able to apply here, please let us know about it. We're genuinely interested in understanding your needs, your priorities, as well as some great ideas that might be out there that we haven't thought about yet. I see a hand raised.
Kind of related to that, I'm just interested to know, are you planning after this to put some pen to paper and have something put out that is maybe just an outline or a framework of what you're envisioning this policy to include and what your initial thoughts are with, the thoughts of this meeting and the public participation? Because it's really hard to comment or envision what this is going to look like based on the little information we have right now.
Absolutely. So like I said, we're at a very early stage of outreach and trying to develop this. Some of the products that we envision putting out in the near future are summaries of the discussions that we've had, summaries of the questions, maybe some potential categories that could be involved in a policy that, as they all start to build up to some potential draft text. So your point is really well taken, and thank you very much for raising it. Please stay tuned. I think our last slide had, ways to sign up for our email list. We had a voicemail set up, but we also have, we're communicating through our website, and we've also been communicating through social media and I guess Instagram and Twitter as well. But fair point. And once again, there will be an opportunity in the future to comment on proposed text, proposed categories. So today is not the only day, and within the next couple of weeks aren't the only times to engage. Alrighty, next one. How does the Water Rights Division plan to coordinate or work with the board's new administrative hearing office? So this one's also slightly outside of the enforcement policy because the enforcement staff, you can kind of think of us as like the prosecution team, but there's also another facet and function that the board's function or role or another responsibility, which is being kind of an arbiter or listening to hearings and making some sort of determination based on that. I see a keyed up microphone here by our Director of Office of Enforcement.
Yeah, so just to respond to that, this policy would be a state board policy, and proceedings before the new administrative hearing office would be subject to the same policy. They would have to adhere to this policy as well.
Thank you so much. All right. Next one, will your approach include financial assistance for metering diversions? Now can be very expensive for small landowners. And so I think this may have been kind of a carryover discussion that we've had last month about the response, or I guess now we're in March, so 2 months ago, about the measurement regulations. And we understand that there may be some costs associated that weren't realized in the past by the regulated community. At this time, we don't have funds to help support that or support those ongoing activities. And so some of the strategies that we pushed out in those types of meetings are looking for potential cost savings by working with neighbors or working with a professional community that you already have you're in contact with to see if there are ways that, bulk pricing or ways that you can use engineering services in a more consolidated format to reduce potential costs. But it was a very nuanced topic for each of these diverters. I like the idea of priority watersheds. Thanks. Priority would be for protection of public trust resources, correct? It could be. And if an injured fish can't file a complaint. And so that one's absolutely correct. And just kind of going back to some of the responsibilities that we have, it's to balance, the uses and needs of water between human beneficial uses as well as for the environment. It's kind of a touchstone that we keep on coming back to. It's part of our mission statement. And so with some of these very difficult types of questions, we kind of grapple with that. And so our hope is that by developing a policy that engages, the regulated community, we may be able to get to some of those answers in a little bit more equitable and expedient fashion. Are there different enforcement divisions within the State Water Board? For example, cannabis versus other water rights. How does prioritization differ? Okay, so we have an Office of Enforcement that's primarily focused on providing legal assistance as well as technical assistance to the regional boards as well as State Water Board when appropriate. But then specifically within the Division of Water Rights, we have two sections at this time that are focused on water rights enforcement. We have a cannabis enforcement section, which has approximately 15 folks in that section, and they're focused on the intersection between water rights and cannabis cultivation. And then the section that I'm in charge of is aptly titled Water Rights Enforcement, so I guess I get everything else. And between our staffs of approximately 30 to 40, we're responsible for enforcing the water rights system in California. Just to put some numbers on that, the number of water rights in California that are currently on file is in excess of 40,000. So obviously we can't do everything. So we're looking for opportunities such as this, such as a policy, to leverage compliance and make that clear understanding in a very complex world as to what are the consequences of non-compliance and what's actually going to happen after a notice of violation.
And it's worth emphasizing that the funding sources for cannabis enforcement versus other types of water enforcement is very different. So the cannabis enforcement section was created by recent legislation tied to passage of Proposition 64. And so the funding for those cannabis water right enforcement staff comes from either fees associated directly with submission of cannabis-related water rights or from the cannabis excise tax. So other fee payers do not at this time support those cannabis water right enforcement staff members.
Alrighty, our next upvoted question. Some riparian claimants may not understand the definition or extent of riparian lands. Is there a way to enforce water use to only riparian lands? So this kind of goes back to the ways that we've tried and been acting in the recent past about progressive enforcement, where we're starting off with ways to help people understand what their responsibilities are before we start jumping into more formal forms of enforcement, letters, potential penalties, or cease and desist orders, or what have you. So those are the opportunities that we're really trying to look. If clarification of riparian responsibilities is something that you would like to see in enforcement policy or further defined, we appreciate the question here as well as the 4 upvotes, and we'll see if there's a way that we can help provide a little bit more clarity on that complicated issue. How are illegal dams treated that are on already fully appropriated watersheds? Wow, we get the easy ones today, don't we? So this one also kind of falls into it depends. It depends on the circumstances that are involved with that specific case that comes up with us. But where we're looking for, and hopefully I'm not sounding too much like a broken record, is that we want to try to provide a little bit more clarity as to what goes into the it depends. You know, are there ways that we can clarify that maybe a certain type of violation has a little bit more clarity and should be treated in this way? If you have an idea about that, or if one of the 4 or 5 people that posed that question, if you can send us some more information, we'd be happy to take a look at it and see if there's an opportunity for us to clarify.
And I think maybe of particular interest is take a look at what we did in the recent cannabis policy update, where we provided a pathway for ponds. What we found is that there's a lot of ponds out there that are illegally constructed and have been there for decades. And so at this point, you almost have created ecosystem services that weren't there before but now are. And so we've looked at a pathway where ponds that maybe should not have been constructed but were come to us, and by working with the Department of Fish and Wildlife and us, and there's a determination that taking the pond out would cause more environmental degradation than keeping it in, that pond could be made viable if there were other conditions placed on it, such as bypass flows and kind of other, maybe some other structures. So that could be something to go for, but I think Kyle's exactly right. It's a little bit it depends.
All right, I want to check back in with the room to see if there are any follow-up questions that we had or anybody else. I can definitely keep going through Slido if this is helpful. Alrighty. So will the enforcement policy make clear the differences in policy, priorities, and the State Water Board's authority during drought? Like I said earlier, we're looking for opportunities to clarify roles, responsibilities. This could definitely be a part of what a policy covers. Thank you for this note here. I think that this is something that we'd like to take back and try to see if we can propose some language that would address this issue. Alrighty, so the next one is how accurate are self-reported water usage statements? Are there plans to validate some portion of those certifications? So yes, the data that we receive sometimes isn't the greatest. And we're looking for ways to appropriately move through to have the right enforcement response for the right alleged violation. So with a policy, we think that we'd have a little bit more clarity as to how to fix those or contact the person who submitted those data. We do, to a degree, on specific cases, look at the data that's submitted and try to rectify whatever we can or contact those diverters, but don't want to get into too much of the detail of maybe some potential cases that may be out there right now. Okay, so then, oh, sorry about that.
I had a comment. I just wanted to applaud OE's emphasis on reporting and emphasize the significance of good reporting and identify that there's some synergies once we get that happening and understand the situation in any stream system. I think it has the potential to make all our other endeavors more efficient. Any complaint, any type of permitting and application, and other things. So I don't know if that was prioritized, but if you are prioritizing that, I'm hoping that moves forward will help make many jobs more efficient in the future. Hopefully that's the goal. I also wanted to make a comment to maybe prioritize new efforts of the division for enforcement. After you roll out a new program, it'd be really good to tie in enforcement to help that program get up and running, like the frost regs or cannabis, whatever it is. It'd be nice to have the enforcement arm working with whatever program is trying to get up and running on the ground. Thank you.
So one note on that last one is that what we're hoping to get out of a policy could be some more definition about that rollout for new regulations. Give us a little bit more guidance on how and when is the appropriate time to move forward with light enforcement touch, such as outreach, and how to make good decisions as to when to have more punitive actions for flagrant non-compliance. So thank you very much for the comment. All right, the next one from M. Aguilar. Does the division envision a general enforcement policy for the entire state, considering individual or blended policy metrics for urban, rural areas, or other? So our hope would be something very broad, something that could address the entire state. If this question sounds like that may be something that they're looking for, if it's something that you're looking for, please let us know. If you feel like the water rights system would be benefited by a specific focused policy in a specific area, we can definitely do that. That's been done in the past. But at this point, we're kind of looking at a very general water rights policy for the entire state of California.
Hey, Kyle, I'm going to suggest that we take a couple more questions off of Slido here and then leave some time after that to engage with the audience that's here in person.
Alrighty, so if there are any questions in the audience, I could definitely address those. Otherwise, I'll take the next three. Oh, coming around with a microphone. Thanks so much.
Sorry.
Hi, I'm just curious if the enforcement stuff is also going to be acknowledging people that are not trying to get a permit at all, because it feels like that should be the focus of the state, is going after people that aren't even trying to get a permit. And I feel like there's so much happening to the people that are actually trying to get compliant right now. So I really hope there's a distinction there. And I'm glad to hear about the comment you made earlier about possibly allowing people that have ponds to come into compliance, because it seems like it's more not prohibitive, but hard on the environment to remediate a site that's already been created sometimes. And ponds are good for rural areas, so thank you.
So thank you very much for the comment, especially the first one. It's something that we're constantly trying to think about when we try to devise enforcement projects, is how do we make the right enforcement action for the right type of violation? Looking for folks that have no intention whatsoever to come into compliance. We see those very differently than those that may have skipped a reporting deadline, or some that may have inadvertently, not complied with some part of their permit or license. So those are types of things that we're hoping that the enforcement policy could try to address or give us a little bit more guidance so that we can move through the system efficiently. Thank you very much. All right. So I think we got that one. Has the Water Board considered monitoring Google Maps, et cetera, to spot illegal dams? So we've used different types of information products in the past. There are some that are branded like Google. There are some that are a little bit more proprietary. So yes, we do try to use technology, especially because we're 40 small staff that are located in Sacramento and responsible for the state of California and over 40,000 water rights. All right, I think our last winner here is, how will the enforcement policy be applied where violations overlaps with the regulatory jurisdiction of other agencies, such as Fish and Game Code 1602? So where we're trying to look at, or where we're trying to be, is in a place where we're mutually supportive of our sister agencies. This is a very specific example as to how we work together, but we envision a policy that is maybe a little bit more public as to exactly how we work with other agencies, such as Department of Fish and Game. And so with that, we appreciate this note. We'll definitely take that into consideration. The water quality enforcement policy has kind of a section on how they coordinate and what are other agencies. We could have something similar like that in the water rights enforcement policy. So as Julie suggested, we really appreciate the time here. We're going to stop with the Slido and move on to the next portion here.
And then also, just as a reminder for the folks as well online, as we've tried to manage the questions online here, we've been archiving them, but we will now make them available all back on the list so that you'll be able to see all the questions that folks asked, even if it wasn't your question. And then we'll go back through, and any that we didn't answer, we'll make sure we put that in writing, and then as well make these materials available online.
I think we got through most of these, so we're going to leave this up here on the screen. We can go ahead and cut our webcast, but we are going to be available. For the folks that are water rights enforcement staff, if you don't mind just raising your hand really quick. If there are any additional questions, we'd be happy to stay in the room and converse later on. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time. We really do appreciate it. After this, we'll be putting out some additional products, such as the summary of their outreach, as well as next steps and actions. Thank you.